morning. So this week we're going to go over Bowen theory. This is one of the theories that I had heard that you might be particularly concerned about how to prepare for the test. I think this is one of the easiest ones to prepare for the test. There are 8 different concepts that we're going to go over, and if you know those 8 concepts, I think you're going to do awesome on the test. The 8 concepts are differentiation of self, triangles, nuclear family emotional process, family projection process, multi-generational transmission process, sibling position, emotional cutoff, and emotional process in society or societal regression. I'm going to go over those, but you also would need to know how to do a genogram. Okay, so let's jump in with some of the foundational information about Bowen theory. Like I mentioned, these are the 8 core concepts I want you to know, and I'll go over each of those. One of the things that you should know is just that the origins of Bowen's theory is kind of interesting. It was based on his study of Darwin's work and his own observations of human families. Let's see if I can get rid of that. It was also developed to be consistent with the theory of evolution. It's called natural systems theory. You should know that because sometimes they won't say Bowen theory, they'll say natural systems theory on the tests to distinguish it from general systems theory. And it's based on observable facts, so as opposed to intrapsychic things that you may not have access to see visually. Bowen described 2 variables which are central to his theory and are key influence on organisms. It's also concepts that have been used by other theories, including Snarch's theory that I've talked about before with some of you. So he focuses on the degree of integration of self. This refers to differentiation of self. And one of his main concepts or main things that he focused on was anxiety. Now, Bowen theory doesn't focus on symptoms in particular, but he's focusing on how anxiety contributes to them. And he looks at how chronic anxiety can contribute to things in 3 different realms: in the emotional, in the social, and in the physical. So, for example, with anxiety, maybe it's going to show up as someone who continually gets sick. In the physical realm. Differentiation of self. So just a little bit more about that. This is the cornerstone of the model. It refers to the degree of emotional strength of the self or the ego strength. Basically, differentiation is the capacity to think and to reflect and to do that without doing it just based on emotional reactions. So when the self is less differentiated, then the behavior is emotional and very reactive. Decisions are very reactive. When the self is more differentiated, then it can be thought out. You can make decisions about the behaviors that you want to engage in or not engage in. Like you're in more control. Differentiation runs along a continuum between sort of enmeshment and fusion. Undifferentiated people tend to react emotionally towards others and tend towards emotional fusion with others. Sometimes you could kind of think about this idea as being similar to codependent behavior. They find it difficult to maintain their autonomy, and differentiated people are able to take a stand on things, think things through, and act on their own beliefs. I think of it this way. It's the ability to differentiate and integrate 2 fundamental drives: attachment and self-regulation. Like we all have sort of this natural tendency to, natural sort of a drive to connect with others, but to also maintain our independence. Differentiation is somewhere in between those 2 drives. So differentiating is distinguishing and balancing self-regulation and emotional attachment. And it's the only way really to get there is to go through relationship struggles that teach you the difference between the 2. So you'll see fake versions of this, people who are overly disconnected, that would be cut off, or people who are overly connected, and that's fusion. Differentiation is that space between those 2, a balance between those 2. So another main concept, it's one of the ones I think of first, is emotional triangles. Basically, relationships, between two people are sort of a little fragile. So when a conflict happens, one of the most common things that happens is that you draw a third person into it to try and stabilize it. So all emotionally significant relationships are shadowed by third parties, relatives, friends, bosses, coworkers, and when there's a tension between two people, connecting or drawing in another person is sort of like a way of letting off steam. The problem is then that it stops things from getting resolved between those two people. Now, sometimes you can use this in a therapeutic way. In fact, that's what therapy is. You're triangulating yourself into the relationship between different people, but you have a consciousness about that, and so you're using it in a way that's helpful. So yeah, triangles. Undifferentiated ego mass, emotional mass, nuclear family emotional process. This is about the emotional forces that are in the family. The lack of differentiation in the family constrains members' abilities to regulate emotionality and to manage anxiety and stress. Think about this. Think maybe you think about yourself in one way, and then you go home for a holiday and you feel yourself drawn back into old patterns. The more differentiated you are, the less that would happen. You would be able to be the consistent, true you around your family and away from your family. Problems in the family emotional process may include reactive distancing between spouses, physical or emotional dysfunction in one spouse, or overt marital conflict. Or this is what happens a lot: is it gets the problems that's happening between a couple then gets projected onto their children, and you'll see this sometimes. You'll get a call and someone will ask you to see their child, and very quickly you'll realize, okay, this child's doing okay, but they're caught in sort of a competition between the two parents. Bowen's original term for this was the excess of emotional reactivity and fusion in families. But the original term was undifferentiated ego mass. Sorry. Okay, family projection process. This is the process by which parents, and this isn't my fault, but if you read his literature, don't throw it all out. But Bowen thought it was particularly the mother. As a father, I would find that offensive, because then I think I don't have as much influence on my child. Okay. Bowen thought particularly the mother, but transmits their lack of differentiation to their children. Spouses with unresolved family of origin issues create a family environment that necessitates an intense focus on one or more of their children. And the child who becomes the object of the projection process becomes the most attached to the parents, positively or negatively. and And one of the least differentiated self, the one who's most vulnerable, is probably the one that's gonna happen to. And with the parents focusing anxiety on the child's ability to adapt is stunted and often causes problems. Okay, this doesn't just happen within one generation. There's often a multi-generational transmission process where levels of functionings are carried from one generation to the next. In one generation, parents project their undifferentiation onto a child, usually the most dependent and least capable of independent problem solving. And then when that child marries, Bowen's theory is that we seek out someone who's at around the same level of differentiation as ourselves. They in turn then pass that on to their child, and the process continues over several generations, and may have a child reach a point where they're unable to deal with daily tensions and conflicts. So normally, Bowen looked at 3 generations. So when you do a genogram, typically you do 3 generations. Side question: how do you think your birth order shapes how you behave or think? One time I was driving around with a group of friends, and someone said, "Well, what do y'all want to do?" And I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And then that kind of continued. We all asked, "Well, I don't know. What do you want to do?" And then we, at some point, somehow we figured out that we were all youngest children. So I was youngest child until I was 8 or 9. So I still think I have the mentality or the shaping of a youngest child. Just this week, I had a couple come in, and one was overly controlling, but frustrated that the other person would never make any decisions. And the other one was resentful of being always told what to do. And I just happened to guess, and it gave me some credibility in session that she was an oldest child and he was a youngest child. And so I know this isn't an absolute, but there are definitely some themes, and so it's really fascinating to look at. Bowen paid a lot of attention to that. He looked at sibling position. So think about it. It's not really rocket science. You learn patterns. So if you're an oldest child and you have responsibility for younger children, you would probably develop some patterns of caretaking differently than a child who's the youngest and always taken care of. So children develop certain fixed personality characteristics. I don't like the word fixed, but Bowen thought that. I think those things can change, but based on position in their families. Yeah, I'd love it if you talk to your friends and share about how you think your birth order has an impact on your personality. Okay, side question. So if you have problems with a family member, it's not just smart to stop being around them. Bowen suggested that there were some downsides to this. He talked about emotional cutoff. This is the denial of unresolved emotional attachment to the previous generation. But the best example is the reactive emotional distancer, who is relatively undifferentiated in spite of appearing aloof or isolated from others. This is the kind of person who might talk about how independent they are, boast about being emancipated from their family, and having really infrequent communication. But the idea of Bowen is that nothing's really been resolved. This is, when I was talking about that continuum of differentiation, this is just cut off. And it's no better than emotional enmeshment. Okay, societal emotional process describes the emotional process in society that influences the emotional process in families. I just think about this as the macro level of the system having an impact on the micro level of the family, and then that's the micro level of the individual. So if there's a society in which there's a lot of anxiety, this can get passed down. If that's going on in general in the system, in the societal system, that will transmit to the family. Okay, some of the goals of Bowenian therapy. The first is to gain insight. So this is a much more teaching model than some of the other models. Like there's some psychoeducation that will take place. The goal is to help them gain insight into intergenerational patterns. That's why you would do the genogram with them and then go through and process it and talk with them about it. The goal is to change patterns to allow family members to differentiate, to help them increase family members' ability to relate on an autonomous cognitive level, a less emotional level. The goal is to change the projective pattern of blame, help people to take responsibility for themselves. Bowenians don't really try to change people or solve problems. Therapy is seen more of an opportunity for people to learn more about themselves and their relationships, and to assume responsibility for their own problems. So some similarities to the theories we talked about last week. Some of the techniques, well, Bowen himself didn't actually like the idea of techniques, and he didn't rely on any formulaic interventions. He said that there are some techniques that he commonly used. The one that he's most famous for, of course, is the genogram. I might give you a handout on some of the ways that people draw out the genograms. But Bowen devised family diagrams or genograms as a way to collect and organize data over at least 3 generations. Many variations of genograms, family pictures, mapping, etc. exist, and we can talk about some of those as we go along. But there's adaptations on the different theories. Like there might be a narrative way of doing this. I do a combination of approaches when I'm doing it now. But if you were doing pure Bowenian, you're going to be looking for repetitive patterns, triangles, cutoffs, coalitions, coincidences of dates, such as the death of a member, or the age of a symptom onset, or you're just looking for things that seem to be themes that occur. Okay. One of the things he really would do, because he feels like emotional cutoff is not helpful, is that he would have people go home again. You would instruct individuals or family members to return home and better get to know their family of origin. And even if there had been significant conflict, like if there had been some real traumatic events that had happened in the family, Bowen would try to help the family, the clients to at least get some sort of closure with their family. Before going home, family members are taught new responses to old patterns so that they don't get pulled back into the same process. They'd be asked, like, what would you want, coming from your very best self, how would you like to respond if, that invitation comes up to go back to old patterns? Process questions. So the process questions are designed to slow people down and to get them to think about how they participate in interpersonal problems. The underlying aspect is to ask questions that get clients to think about their role, the role that they play in their family, and to help them brainstorm about new ways to interact with their family as well. Bowen's style was controlled, detached. For example, in couples work, he expected the partners to talk to him and not to each other, and he would attempt to resolve the fusion that exists and maximize self-differentiation. In general, like with families, you might ask questions like, given what happened recently, how do you want to react when you're with the children and the subject of their father comes up? I actually use these kind of things all the time. I'm looking for like an invitation of their best selves. So in your very best self, how would you like to respond? Okay, if you could do a redo about that in the future, if he does something that frustrates you in the future, how would you like to act from your very best self? Along those lines. Bowen would also help clients in defining and clarifying the emotional process in the family. The goal is to get people to understand, identify, and think about emotional processes rather than enacting them. When emotional processes are enacted in therapy, the therapist just encourages the family to recognize and think about them. We talked a little bit about this term, and it's one of the terms you really want to know is the idea of content versus process. A Bowenian therapist really needs to be conscious of process that's happening so that they don't get caught up in the content. Another intervention is keeping self detriangled from the emotional process. Bowen believed that conflict between two people will resolve automatically if both remain in emotional contact with a third person who can relate actively to both without taking sides of either. All the theories that are good do this. So if you find yourself siding with someone, you're actually contributing to the problem. Just a side note. The therapist needs to remain strictly neutral and differentiated to remain detriangulated. Okay, demonstrating differentiation of self during the clinical process. Part of the big work, like most supervision for Bowenian therapists, is self of the therapist work and working on sort of your own emotional work. Knowing your own principles and beliefs and being consistent with them is key. Part of the issue is to be consistent and yet tactful. Your goal as a therapist is also to model differentiation. Sorry, I just like this joke. I know these are things you don't want to hear, but I'm enjoying the hell out of saying them. That's not actually an example of differentiation. The intention is bad. Okay. Teaching the functions of emotional systems. Genograms could be used to teach intergenerational transmission processes, understand current emotional processes, and identify cutoff, fusions, and functional shifts. I had a couple I did this with this week, and all throughout both sides was emotional cutoff. So we had a conversation about that. And so again, it's a more teaching model. It is a little bit more insight focused, whereas some other models are actually against insight, and we'll get into those as we get into those theories. So what is a genogram? I'm sure you've done some of this, but a genogram is a family diagram, which can be thought of as going a step beyond a family tree. Genograms provide a way of mapping out family patterns, relationships across at least 3 generations, and genograms report information on the family structure and may help map out intergenerational patterns. I'll send you something about this, or I'll post something about this. Just the different ways you can map out. Some of Some of these vary, but for the most part, most therapists do it in a similar way. Okay, but I'll provide you with that. If not, you might look at I'll send you some readings also that you could look at it. He also looks at closeness of relationships. You can depict the type of relationships of two people, two family members, with lines connecting those persons. For example, two people with a normal relationship would have one line drawn between them. Those with a close relationship may have two between them, and those with a fused or extremely close relationship would have three lines between them. A dotted line between two people might indicate a distant relationship. I won't go through all of these, but I'll let you look at them. There's basically a symbol for everything. The goal is to have it be sort of consistent across the field, so that like if you ever had to transfer a client, that you'll be able to convey the information in a way that they would be able to pick up. I think if you're doing genograms often, maybe it's good to include sort of a map or a guide to what the symbols are meaning for you. Triangles are a really big one, so you do want to look and see where triangles are existing within the family. Okay. Yeah, there's lots of information you can get. I always look at where the people are immigrated from, or where they're from originally. I did have I had a case recently where both members of the couple had come generationally, their families had come from war-torn countries, and we kind of looked at how trauma had sort of had an impact and trickled down, and that it was also reflective in the ways that they reacted to each other. So I think there's some really interesting things you can do there. Here's an example of a genogram, but we'll do a little bit of practice with that this week.